That's it.
Yes.
Everything. Everyone run! Run!
A rapid, heavy, and unstoppable assault wave has besieged Moscow. Everywhere in Russia, from north to south, is engulfed in flames. Airports are closing, air defenses are collapsing, panic and helplessness are increasing. And at an unprecedented speed since February 15th, 2026, Moscow has been encircled by a ring of fire. Every corner of the country is occupied by Ukrainian drones and missiles. There is nowhere safe to take cover. To break this pressure, Putin unleashed a large-scale attack on Ukraine on the night of February 22nd. Energy facilities in Odessa, the massive production plant belonging to the American food giant Manderly and Trustyanets, and civilian infrastructure and buildings in Kiev and its surroundings were hit. Ukraine's response to the war's terrorizing attacks was fast and fierce. On February 22nd at noon, Ukraine launched hundreds of drones toward Moscow without hiding in the darkness of night. The security of the 20 million-strong metropolis was wiped out. This was the final phase of weeks of massive retaliation and 12 years of revenge. The nationwide carpet plan was activated. The attacks, which peaked on February 22nd, shut down all airports in and around Moscow. Hundreds of Ukrainian drones appeared like ghosts on radar and locked onto their target, heading straight for Moscow. Sirens began blaring at a frantic pace in the capital and surrounding security networks. Faced with this situation, the Kremlin administration was forced to take one of the most radical steps in aviation protocols by activating the carpet plan nationwide. Implementing this plan meant closing the airspace to civilian flights and turning the sky into a military operation zone. Vnukovo, Domodedovo, Sheremetyevo, and Zhukovsky airports are the massive arteries connecting the country to the outside world and its own internal regions. Operations at these facilities were halted within seconds, resulting in a shutdown situation. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin stated that air defense systems had neutralized 20 drones approaching the city, attempting to convey that the situation was under control. Operationally, however, the reality at the terminals painted a much more complex picture of panic. Numerous flights were canceled, and over 60,000 passengers were stranded at the terminals. Footage leaked on social media captured moments where Orlan-type Russian countermeasure drones were desperately trying to track down targets in the air. However, these manual interventions are insignificant in the face of hundreds of autonomous threats covering the sky. On the ground, the situation is even more dire. The harshest snowstorm in 200 years that hit Moscow on February 19th had already paralyzed the capital city of 20 million. Highways connecting cities are blocked by impossible snowdrifts and massive chain reaction accidents. The halt in logistics means not only civilians, but also the military supply chain has frozen. The state's investment illusions are also collapsing one by one under these harsh natural conditions. The panic within Moscow can no longer be concealed. Even in propaganda broadcasts, even the regime's loyal supporters are being crushed under the weight of reality. The statements of renowned Russian blogger Gleiberman painfully summarize the breakdown behind the front lines and the collapse of the system. Gleiberman states that 500 restaurants have closed in Moscow. Businesses are shutting down, and logistics costs have reached unbearable levels. Even soldier supplies are failing. Gleiberman's cry that we will be ruined by the end of the year and we will experience a severe collapse signals the approaching disaster. This is not a simple complaint. It is the admission by figures who have loyally served the regime for years and been part of the propaganda machine that the ship is taking on water. This massive shockwave was not a sudden anomaly. The fault lines began to fracture distinctly around 9 a.m. on February 15th. The Ukrainian armed forces launched a multi-layered, sophisticated infiltration operation targeting the Russian mainland. In the first wave, 200 long-range unmanned aerial vehicles entered Russian territory, followed by another 100 around 11 a.m. The target was not just the capital. 12 different regions, including Krasnodar, Belgorod, Sochi, and Moscow, were at the center of a simultaneous attack. Aviation routes were immediately locked down. Russia's southern routes and more than a dozen airports in Moscow have been experiencing continuous temporary closures for days. Even the most severe snowstorm to hit the capital in 200 years on February 19th did not paralyze the aviation sector as much as the impact of these technological attacks. This dark week between February 15th and February 23rd turned into a complete nightmare for civil aviation. The events of the third week of February 2026 are an example of a multidimensional asymmetric war involving not only civil aviation but also military aviation and energy infrastructure. The closure of an airport produces seismic waves that are much deeper than just a few delayed flights. The simultaneous suspension of operations at Moscow's 4 main civil aviation hubs for hours becomes a factor that shakes the entire logistics and economic network through a chain reaction. The chaos that emerged with the implementation of the Carpet Plan on February 22nd proves how fragile the ground is for civil aviation. A similar series of attacks in July 2025 cost Russian airlines $254 million in a single stroke. The immediate damage caused by the February 22nd shutdowns is estimated to be between $20 million and $50 million per day. The cancellation cost for each Boeing 737-800 commercial passenger aircraft held on the ground or diverted ranges from $190,000 to $292,000. In addition, the infrastructure stress caused by the most severe snowstorm in 200 years, which hit the capital on February 19th and dumped 70% of the average monthly snowfall in a single day, has compounded the situation. At this point, where natural disaster and military operations intersect, Moscow's crisis management capacity has been completely halted. Reading about Moscow airports repeatedly shutting down only through the lens of angry passengers. Waiting in terminals or canceled vacation flights may mean missing the most critical part of the picture. Huge facilities such as Sheremetyevo, Vnukovo, and Domodedovo are not only Russia's gateways to the world, they are also the most vital logistics centers of the multi-billion-dollar parallel import network set up to circumvent Western sanctions. Microchips, drone parts, precision optical sensors, and aviation spare parts that cannot be sourced directly due to sanctions are typically flown into these airports via cargo planes from Dubai, Istanbul, or Beijing. The suspension of civilian flights due to the drone threat in the skies has simultaneously led to a sharp decline in this gray cargo traffic, which is the lifeblood of the Russian defense industry and technology market. The mechanics of this logistical disruption produce a rather ruthless chain reaction. When a cargo plane is diverted to alternative airports because Moscow's airspace is closed, the shipping chain for sensitive technological products is instantly broken. Customs warehouses clustered around Moscow, secret distribution centers, and truck fleets that would deliver these products to military factories in the Ural Mountains suddenly become inoperative. The diversion of cargo to inadequate storage facilities in different cities can extend supply times by weeks. The fact that microchips needed for the camera of a reconnaissance drone, urgently required at the front, or the guidance system of a cruise missile are trapped in a warehouse outside Moscow risks slowing down production lines. Airport crises on the ground are only the visible face of Ukraine's much broader and more sophisticated strategy. Looking at the bigger picture, the real factor that is checkmating the Kremlin is the relentless war of attrition waged by the Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces, USF, deep within Russian territory. Open data presented by USF Commander Major Robert Brovdy reveals the gravity of the situation. In the first 48 days of 2026, a total of 240 sensitive strategic targets were destroyed in Russia and the occupied territories. Deep strike battalions, such as the Hungarian Birds, Nemesis, and Raid, have shifted the center of gravity of the war directly to the heart of Russia's industrial and energy infrastructure. The profile of these 240 targets proves that the targeted strategy is a flawless implementation of the concepts of logistical strangulation and blinding the bear. Among the targets hit are 9 massive capacity oil refineries, including Novokuybishevsky, Ibsky, and Ryazan, Tuapse, and Volgograd, as well as the gas processing plant in Astrakhan and the Tamaneftegaz oil terminal. Not stopping there, critical chemical facilities such as Shchekino Azot and Dorogobuz, as well as at least 12 strategic military airfields including Engels, Kirov, Milarovo, and Saki, were targeted. Between February 1st and 17th, Ukrainian forces struck 16,000 enemy targets, completely wiping out the Russian army's rear supply lines. The greatest military achievement of this large-scale strategic offensive is that it has forced Russia into an impossible dilemma. Relentless attacks on Moscow and deep-seated energy facilities have forced the Kremlin to withdraw air defense systems from the front lines to protect the mainland. According to Ukrainian General Staff data and independent researchers, Russia has lost 1,331 air defense systems since the start of the war. While existing Pantsir and S-400 batteries are being concentrated around Moscow to protect the capital and oligarchs' facilities, the front line and especially the Crimean Peninsula are left without an air defense umbrella. With the gradual fall of radars and command centers in Crimea, Russia's geopolitical stronghold in the Black Sea has been transformed into a death trap. More than 1,300 drones and 1,400 guided bombs and missiles that Russian sources should have allocated to the front line have now turned into a rain of debris falling on their own citizens in the capital's skies. These operations, carried out by Ukraine using Beaver, OSA, and modified FPV drones, have rendered Russia's multi-billion-dollar air defense doctrine obsolete, with systems costing just a few thousand. The chaos at Moscow airports is merely a reflection of this massive technological asymmetry and diplomatic stalemate. As Russian aviation and military infrastructure are crushed day by day under the strangulation strategy, Putin's long-term war-sustaining capacity has suffered irreparable damage. These internal, infrastructural, and economic tremors are reshaping Russia's image in the outside world, particularly its credibility in the eyes of its strategic partners in Asia. Global power projection relies heavily on a country's capacity to ensure its own internal security. It becomes extremely difficult for a state whose capital has been under air raid alerts for weeks, whose main airports are constantly closed to flights, and whose most critical energy facilities face the threat of being wiped out, to maintain its image as a reliable supplier on the international stage. Giants like China and India, Moscow's biggest refuge against Western sanctions, are closely monitoring these logistical and security crises. For these countries, Russia is a massive station providing cheap energy. However, the complex logistics network known as the Shadow Fleet, established to circumvent sanctions, is facing significant operational stress. As Russian ports and infrastructure become targets, the risk of attacks on loading facilities in St. Petersburg or Black Sea ports is driving up marine insurance premiums, while extending the waiting times for ships trapped in ports. This situation has the potential to cause disruptions in oil flows to Asian markets. More importantly, this situation weakens the Kremlin's bargaining power at the table. These vulnerabilities in the supply chain may pave the way for Beijing and New Delhi to demand much higher discounts from Moscow. Russia, struggling to protect its own refineries, is sliding from being an energy superpower dictating terms to Asian buyers into the position of a desperate seller open to any concession to offload its goods. Every successful strike by Ukraine against strategic depth further erodes Putin's diplomatic capital and calls into question his deterrence among allies. Furthermore, a similar erosion in the arms export market appears likely. The performance of Russian air defense systems against modified commercial drones or relatively slow-moving Ukrainian UAVs raises serious questions for global buyers of these systems. The reassessment of military technologies that have been marketed as invincible for years, in light of what is happening in the skies over Moscow, jeopardizes Russia's long-term defense industry contracts. This asymmetric warfare is not only creating physical destruction on the ground, it is also gradually dismantling Russia's international invincible bear myth, pulling the country into diplomatic isolation and economic encirclement. Days of drone attacks and repeated lockdowns of Moscow's airspace indicate that an irreversible threshold has been crossed in the dynamics of the war. As advanced air defense shields falter in the face of low-cost asymmetric threats, the Kremlin's illusion of a safe zone for its people begins to crumble.